Welcome to the Watershed Learning Network. In this module, you will learn about equity and environmental justice. We will focus on issues of equity and environmental justice in urban watersheds. Development in urban watersheds interacts with water infrastructure to influence communities differently via flooding and exposure to contaminants. According to Merriam-Webster, one of the definitions of equity is justice according to the natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias or favoritism, something that is equitable. In the case of equity related to the environment, it may be helpful to think about the equitable distribution of perceived ecosystem services and disservices that an individual receives from the environment. You can learn more about ecosystem services in another WLN module. Ecosystem services are the benefits people derive from ecosystems. Watersheds can provide important ecosystem services including water purification, flood control, fisheries, recreational opportunities, and others. However, they can also produce ecosystem disservices for humans living within and outside of their boundaries. Saunders and Luck defined ecosystem disservices as outcomes of ecosystem functions that negatively affect human communities. Urban communities may be subject to ecosystem disservices associated with water, including but not limited to flooding associated with storm events and sea level rise, and exposure to contaminants and vectors of disease such as mosquitoes. It is also important to understand that the same environmental condition may simultaneously provide an ecosystem service and a disservice. For example, a rainstorm may provide an important ecosystem service by recharging or replenishing drinking water supplies, but also may lead to extreme flooding in certain areas. Notably, the same event may produce services for one community while subjecting other groups to negative situations in the same watershed. For instance, the rainstorm we previously mentioned may provide everyone within a given watershed the services of drinking water recharge, but in communities living further downstream, they also may be subjected to flooding. This is the case in Atlanta's Proctor Creek. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Integrating ideas of environmental justice into discussions of equity and the balance of ecosystem services and disservices can be an effective way to examine issues associated with urban watershed management. For example, when thinking about poverty, it can strongly impact the exposure to disease and contaminants in urban watersheds. Interactions between poverty, public services, and healthcare costs can interact with negative environmental conditions in urban watersheds, including flooding of contaminated water and increased amounts of standing water, and increase the exposure of communities to both pathogens and chemicals. Using Atlanta as an example, poorer communities are often affected by combined sewers and influenced by flooding. Therefore, people living in affected neighborhoods are exposed to raw sewage and contaminants in flooding streams. Oftentimes, neighborhoods subject to flooding are characterized by high densities of abandoned homes. Exposure to pathogens can make it much more difficult for people to escape poverty. In this figure, we can see that though the orange and blue circles are making the same amount of money, the blue circle, which is exposed to much more disease, has to have a lot more income or make more money to be able to escape the poverty trap. Increasing poverty also influences the ability of a person to cope with illness. Poor people can fall into poverty much more rapidly when exposed to the same levels of infection. In this case, we can see that the orange circle, which is making more money, is much more resilient to disease and less apt to fall into the poverty trap because it takes much more disease to push it into poverty. Discussions about environmental justice and equity are often discussions about ethics. As the name distributive justice suggests, theories of distributive justice attempt to explain the most ethical way that goods, services, and opportunities should be distributed within a society. For example, one simple distribution might be everyone should be given the exact same amount of goods, services, and opportunities. On one hand, this may seem the fairest scheme because everyone is treated completely equally. But what is being distributed is not always wealth or income. What can be negative? This is especially true when we think about environmental issues. The water crisis in Flint, Michigan is an example of a recent environmental justice challenge faced by communities in urbanizing watersheds. A tool to examine potential environmental justice issues in your watershed is the EJ screen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. You can visit that using the link at the bottom of your slide. The agency has generated an environmental justice index, which they define as a number that combines environmental and demographic information for a place. There is an EJ index for each environmental indicator, which is listed on the screen. The EJ index highlights which block groups contribute most towards low-income or minority residents nationwide that have a higher environmental indicator score on average than the rest of the U.S. population. To calculate a single EJ index for one block group, EJ Screen multiplies the environmental indicator by demographic information. And this demographic information includes things like percent low income and percent minority, and the total population living in the group. You can see the index and more information on the government website. But basically what this allows you to do is examine communities that are differentially affected with negative environmental outcomes that's related also to their level of income and the percent minority living within a given community. In this slide, you can see differences between two maps, the environmental indicator and the environmental justice index. The map on the right highlights which block groups contribute most toward low-income and minority residents nationwide that have a higher environmental indicator score. In this case, potential exposure to toxins from wastewater discharge, and this is compared to the average U.S. population. If you would like to explore potential environmental justice issues in your watershed, consider visiting EJ Screen website and map your city.